Hey 3D MJers, this is Andrea Valdez and you're listening to the 3D Muscle Journey podcast. Today I am talking to Eric Helms and Brad Loomis all about overtraining and overreaching for bodybuilders, powerlifters, and anyone else trying to get as jacked and strong as possible. To start, Eric hits us with some clinical definitions to consider, a wide array of scenarios and fallacies about how one becomes overtrained, and a lot of practical takeaways on how to test your limits and maximize your training while keeping yourself pain and injury free. Also, Brad offers us some examples of when he sees red flags of overreaching as a coach, how he assesses and handles them, and how you can specifically manipulate your training load to mitigate damage and continue making progress long term. This is one of my favorite conversations we've had lately as it pertains to all strength sports in all points of their season, and it should provide some clarity and experimental guidelines to any lifter who is looking to go that extra mile in a safe and effective manner. As always, if you have any feedback or comments on this particular episode, head over to 3dmusclejourney.com or go to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/team3dmj and leave it under podcast number 103. Thanks for checking out our show, and please enjoy my conversation all about overtraining and overreaching with Brad Loomis and Eric Helms. All right, so a couple months ago, Eric, you wrote this really super important, awesome, well-shared article about whether or not overtraining is a myth. And I would like for you to tell us about that so we could start from there and then kick it off.
So I wrote a part of a roundtable in there on the question, does overtraining exist? And this is kind of a topic that has been, it's one of the pendulums that swings in the fitness industry, I would say, especially in the bodybuilding, powerlifting, weightlifting communities. And I think a lot of the times it's a case of people talking across each other. Because if we want to go to the textbook definition of overtraining syndrome that you see in research, it's basically doing so much to the point where you've overwhelmed your adaptive ability and you're actually backsliding and becoming depressed and having symptomology where you aren't going to improve performance, even with bringing back volume and tapering and doing the things we do when we think we're quote unquote overtrained for sometimes months. And that's just simply something that doesn't really occur in bodybuilders especially, and rarely in powerlifters in that specific definition. But on the other side, why is that definition even useful to us? Don't we care about what's an appropriate amount to do to progress and what's optimal progression and things like injury? So injury isn't technically overtraining, but it's still something we would want to avoid.
Yes, I would agree.
Thank you for your input.
Yeah, after all my years of studying, I'm going to use my critical thinking skills to agree with you. Okay, so, and isn't that usually an endurance athlete type of problem?
That's typically where it shows up. And that's because when your intensity is that much lower, and I'm comparing it to lifting. Like
a marathoner versus a 1RM squatter kind of person.
Absolutely. Yeah. You can do so much volume, so, where does overtraining syndrome pop up by that clinical textbook definition I gave before? It's rarely in strength athletes. I think I've seen it occur in contest preppers, and I've seen it occur in some CrossFit athletes, what I would describe as where months they're not able to get back to their old performance, and they're, even with getting out of a deficit, bringing their calories back up, etc. Mm-hmm. If they just had that brutal of a period of training and prep it in general. I've had some contest preppers who are just messed up way longer than you'd expect, but it's quite rare, everyone's messed up from contest prep, but some people are feeling great after 6 weeks, but some people are still jacked up after 6 months. It's not normal. Typically is associated with doing some crazy stuff during prep and being very emotionally stressed by it. But yeah, I've only seen it happen in I wouldn't even say a CrossFitter is a strength athlete. It's an athlete who does strength work and sometimes it even is a dominant variable. But they're doing so much else. They sometimes have elements of endurance athlete training in there. So that's kind of makes sense to me how they would get there.
Yeah. And so just more setup for the rest of the show. Like, how would you contrast that to overreaching?
Exactly.
By definition.
If we want to stick with textbook definitions, there's overtraining and overtraining syndrome, which are at the top, and then there's overreaching, and there's technically two types. There's functional and non-functional overreaching. And I think probably the easiest way to define these is that functional overreaching is a useful way of overreaching. Like you do enough so that you're actually backsliding, and then after a taper, you see an increase in performance relative to where you were before the taper. Non-functional overreaching is that you backslide, you do the taper and all that stuff, and you're kind of just back to where you were. So you're not wrecked for 4 months and lost all motivation to train, but it was kind of like, well, that didn't work, and you're just back to training again. So that's kind of probably the most useful definitions we have. Overtraining, months of even with tapering and bringing calories up and chilling, you're still messed up and not back to old performance. Functional overreaching, you see a decrement in performance in the short term. We're talking weeks. You do a taper and you're better. Non-functional overreaching, after that taper, you're not.
Okay. So since Brad is here,
yes, I am here.
He is here. He is here. Have we done this functional overreaching tapering with Brad? You as his coach, Eric, and Brad as the athlete. Have we done this on purpose?
I would say so.
If we did, I didn't know it.
Well, actually, that's a good point. We didn't really see a decrement in performance before the taper. Yeah. So I typically don't. It's rare. Well, that's not rare, actually. I would say Bryce, not always by plan, ends up doing functional overreaching for a lot of his competitions. We'll get to a point where he's just too jacked up and we have to call audibles, often intensity related or just minor injury related. But overall, I would say if you were to kind of take a bird's eye view, functional overreaching is not necessarily the goal. I just put someone through a pretty intensive peaking strategy, and then there is a taper, but I am mostly looking just to drop fatigue versus trying to overreach and then super compensate in that kind of traditional sense.
Okay.
Yeah, because I would say, first of all, on the athlete's end, I must have been in the realm of functional overreaching because I never saw a digression in either body composition nor strength.
Yeah, we didn't even get you to functional overreaching. We just
had a high volume block.
we had a high volume block, a high intensity block, and then a taper, and then he competed and did well. So it's
Okay, yeah. So I'm gonna pick from there. If it is useful and functional to do this overreaching, and with Brad, he continues to improve without ever needing that. When is it useful and why is it useful if you can still continue progressing without it?
I think that's a great question because I'm not that confident in the model of you overreach, taper, and supercompensate. I think that there's a little bit of magic that goes on in there that I don't fully buy. I do think it makes a lot of sense that when you push training to drive an adaptation, to the most you can do to where it's driving that adaptation maximally, there is an unavoidable amount of fatigue or stress that comes with it that also takes away from that output, kind of that two-factor fitness fatigue model. And of course, all that happens with the background of all the stress that goes on and what's going on in the brain of the athlete and the life of the athlete outside of the gym. But all else being equal, I think the taper is primarily, at least I'm most confident in saying, its purpose is to remove the stress and not do it for too long or too much to actually reduce the adaptations gained from the training that caused that stress. Rather than saying we've invested into this super compensation, I beat somebody up and if we just cash in the chips, we're going to see greater adaptations than we could have believed from doing this taper, which is kind of the way some theorists and coaches and athletes will talk about overreaching and tapering.
Yeah.
It reminds me of the way some athletes who are just simply not in shape by the time they get on stage are kind of wishing on a star on Thursday night that after they cut water and load a hell of a lot of carbs and mess with their sodium and potassium, that they'll wake up looking shredded. I kind of see that as the same way. Like if you've never touched more than a 260 kilo deadlift, and you think that by doing a massive hardcore training block that you barely survive during the last 4 weeks before your 5th week taper, that somehow you're going to pull 270 or 280 in comp if you've never even touched it, that's unlikely in most cases. And it's certainly not something that's going to consistently happen, even if it does happen once or twice.
Yeah. Man, there's so much to talk about. I'm so excited for the rest of this, and it's like 10 minutes in. I know. I'm real giddy. Well, okay, so Brad, when we talked about this topic and opened it up, you immediately were like, oh my God, I think I did this to my son. Because Brad programs for Xander, who is a football athlete. And I realize that this is a different sport, but I think we're going to go into some principles that would go for strength athletes as well. Not that he doesn't lift, because he does. But tell us a little bit about that situation, Brad, so we can kind of unpack it and stiff.
Okay, yeah, sure. Because I think if I kind of digress just a little bit before I get into that, and I kind of touch on or expand on what Eric was talking about, I think, if there is such a thing as overtraining, I feel like it's more so an environment than actual, specific to volume and frequency and things like that. There's a lot of contributing factors. Like you can make yourself feel like you're overtrained if you're in an overly exacerbated caloric deficit while trying to progress, right?
Yes.
You can
There's
make
both the recovery and the training side of it that go into the result of overtraining. Yeah.
Exactly. Or folks that, they feel like they're going to increase their work capacity if they go out and do HIIT training every day in the morning, and then they do their strength training at night. That's an environment that they put themselves in to where it feels like overtraining. Heck, even, people who might be trying to progress aggressively in their program and they're going through a divorce, or they are, have an unusual amount of stress in their lives. They are covering call and they've been up, for 2 nights and they've got 10 hours of sleep in the last week, that's an environment, for overtraining. And a lot of times I think that the two get kind of misinterpreted because it's got to be because of training. Right. It's training is the reason that I'm overtrained. Everything else in life really doesn't matter. Right. It doesn't affect training. Well, it does. It does. It's overall, it's an overall overarching theme. Right. So that being said, two things come to mind. It have just happened to me recently that I'll kind of share that kind of all add up, to overtraining. And I'll give a minor example and the example of my son, and I'll give a major example and an example of an old client that I used to train, tons and tons of years ago, where he actually ended up hospitalized.
Oh, geez.
So, where's the minor example?
Yeah, let's do that one.
So let's set the stage. So my son, he's getting ready for football camp, right? He's getting ready for what they call the double days. They call it Hell Week, right? And Friday night, after he gets done with his little 7-on-7 scrimmage, it's just kind of a little fun game that they play. He comes back and he says, "Gosh, my hamstrings are really, really sore." And so I says, in a good sore and a bad sore. And he says, "Well, I think it's a good sore." And so I just kind of left it at that. It was a hard workout, right? And so the next morning we were going to do a little group lift together. And so I asked him, I says, "How does your hamstring feel?" And he says, "Well, it's a little bit sore, but it's better than it was last night." So I'm thinking DOMS, right? So it's just DOMS. And looking back at it, that was the demise, right? So we go ahead and we have our group workout. It goes away. It's all gone. His hamstring feels great. And so he proceeds by his last lift to set a PR in his sumo deadlift. He deadlifts I think 330 pounds or something like that.
And he's 15.
He's 15. Yeah, and he weighs 200 pounds. So it was a good solid lift. It was a good solid single at 9.5 RPE. Taking tomorrow off, enjoy, right? Enjoy your day off, and enjoy the PR and celebrate, right? So, of course, Monday morning, Monday night, he's got a double day. He's going to work out Monday morning with the football team, and he's going to work out Monday night with the football team. Well, duh. What does the football team do? They compete, and usually they compete by sprinting. They pair up, they race. Who can get 20 yards first, right? Especially if they're competing for a position. Like for him, for example, it's the fullback position. So he's paired up with the fullbacks. And sure enough, come Monday night, his hamstring, he can't even run on it. And he's limping and he's cramping up. And I'm like, oh God, why did this happen? Well, duh, think about it. He was in a perfect environment for it. He had a good workout with a little soreness on Friday night. We deadlifted something he's never deadlifted, on Saturday. And then we throw him in with a bunch of stress, with sprinting on Monday. And I'm really kicking myself now, because now that I look at it in retrospect, that was a perfect environment for an overtraining type of an injury, right? So there's a lot of variables that led to that. I think if we, would have just been a little bit smarter about that, he would be fine today and not feeling the effects of either a strained or pulled hamstring.
Yeah, let's get into that a little bit. So rather than overtraining, right, because that's more of a chronic thing, that would be more like acutely we set him up for injury, or we like, I wouldn't even say that. Is that even an overreach if it's like
Well, this is the whole purpose of my article, is that the strict definitions are only useful in an academic sense so that we can examine those conditions. They're not that useful in the realm of strength and conditioning and weightlifting and bodybuilding and powerlifting, because that's typically not going to be the thing that bottlenecks our performance. The thing that's actually going to prevent us from being successful is like something like what Xander experienced. Exactly. Yeah,
so maybe there's time for a new definition. Eric, you start things like this. Think about that. Make a more microscopic little thing that's like, don't be an idiot.
Well, I think it just really comes down to an imbalance between stress and recovery, right? Or doing too much. It's, that is essentially non-functional overreaching, right? Yeah. If you think about it, like he couldn't perform, so he had digressed. And maybe you could call this an injury. We're not sure. It doesn't sound like it was a full-blown hamstring strain. It may be like below a grade 1, just a crap ton of muscle damage that has not actually had the chance to recover, that's hindering his ability to move.
Yeah, and it's just like localized versus full body is done. I need to sleep for 2 days or something like that. It's just one area. Okay.
I would say the output is localized, but the causes may not be. You know?
So it could be overall global stress that caused this one particular aggravated area to be more weak than it could have been had he rested it correctly.
Which is exactly kind of how I term the environment. There's a lot of variables that went into that, right? And I certainly don't think that he was, I don't know, I'm still kind of the opinion that is there really true overtraining? I'm not really sure. I'm not convinced myself, but I think that there are a lot of contributing factors that lead to things that can be interpreted as overtraining, kind of like we've got here. So, and the second of my extreme examples, again, it's not like a global overtraining type thing. It's kind of like a specific thing that happened where a lot of variables led to that one specific thing, right? So I met up with an old client of mine a long time ago. I was training this kid when he was like 14, 15 years old, and now here he is today. He's 30 years old, right? Haven't seen him in forever. And he says, I kind of put myself into a little bit of a pickle. I decided to start training again because I really loved it when we did it. So I went ahead and hit a biceps and triceps workout with a buddy of mine. And they proceeded to do an ungodly amount of volume. I mean, like hundreds of repetitions, on their biceps and their triceps. Basically, going into this particular session, he's a paramedic, right? And so they're in sometimes ambulances for hours and hours and hours. He doesn't drink a lot of water because he doesn't have time to pee. So for 3 nights, he didn't drink a lot of water. He's probably very dehydrated, his creatinine's probably 1.5 or 2. then proceeds to put himself in this environment that he's not used to, and he literally goes into renal failure. And he ends up being seen in the emergency room following, basically 36 hours after this arm training session that he did.
So the dude got rhabdo from an arm workout.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Wow.
Yeah. Being low on sleep because he was up for 3 nights, and he was dehydrated. He didn't drink a lot of water, So here again, this is an extreme example of what could be misinterpreted as overtraining, but it's all the environment, being dehydrated, being low on sleep, probably 3 days of stress. And on his first day off, he basically triples that stress.
No, I mean, that's actually a good example of, on a very definable physiological scale, overwhelming your ability to adapt. You've done so much work that you've caused so much muscle damage that with your ability to process the metabolites, if you will, of muscle damage, it's not really a metabolite, but the broken down muscle tissue, the product of muscle damage, thank you, he wasn't actually able to process that, and it overwhelmed his capacity to deal with it. And he would have died without having gone to the hospital, believe it or not.
Yeah.
It's just crazy.
So again, a very specific and extreme example, but it's an environment. There were several things besides just the training that led to that particular circumstance.
Yeah. So, and I think where it becomes, like you said, not a super useful definition is because shit like this happens versus, like we're talking about a marathoner, it's sneakier then because they never feel, like when you're doing a heavy 3 on back squats or like deadlifts, there's a lot of stress at this time currently right now, in this moment, right? And when you're, doing burnout sets of curls or whatever that guy was doing, you feel it in the moment. But if you're running like 6 miles, say that's at least 30 minutes if you're super duper fast, but usually much longer. And the intensity is so low that you can breathe and you can carry this forever. And that's when it's things like you said, it's sneakier, Eric. It takes so much longer to accumulate. And then there's like the stress fractures and the, hormonal issues and the things that you don't feel the moment you get a stress fracture. Usually you don't feel the moment that your blood panel is all out of whack. And so that's when it's, what's the word? Insidious? Is that like sneaky? Like it creeps up on you?
Insidious is a perfect word because when you're dealing with endurance athletes, you can have, before an injury or an acute issue prevents you from performing well, you can have these chronic issues develop over time to where, man, you're running more miles.
Like 6 months or something to come up, right?
Yeah, you're running more and more miles and your times are getting slower and slower, which is sort of expected because you're increasing volume. But then as you start to taper, it's still smaller. You're still slower and your resting heart rate has changed and your sleep quality has gone down. And all of a sudden, you're unable to recover as effectively. You're less motivated to train, and this convergence of multiple symptomology that we've now coined the overtraining syndrome is what is resulting in you performing poorly. But you don't have an acute injury, and you don't have rhabdomyolysis, or it's not just simply I'm trying to lift the 3 rep max and I can't, because you can always run submaximally. It's just you're in a higher heart rate zone than you should be, given what you think you're doing. So it's I think the reason that's the main reason we don't see it in lifting is that something else becomes the bottleneck for performance before overtraining syndrome ever could. And to get to the level of work to where you would get there is an absurd amount of lifting volume.
Yeah, and then you'd think if you are, and then, like an argument would be like, well, I'm just not going to lift so heavy that I can't do it, but then it's sort of the same thing. Like it won't take you as long to get jacked up as an endurance runner. Maybe you won't get as jacked up as soon as the people Brad talked about. But then at the same time, like, is that an effective strength protocol to be like, I want to get as big and strong as possible, but not lift super heavy so often? So it's that weird.
Yeah, I think the main point I made in my article, going back to that, the word insidious, was that for a lifter, you're not going to be accidentally overtraining. Like, that's not going to happen. Like, you'll be highly aware of it. you will have decided after your seventh, full body to failure hypertrophy session in a row with 20 sets per muscle group that takes 3 hours, that even though I have intense DOMs everywhere, I only slept 3 hours last night because I was disturbed by it and I was in pain, I'm still going to do 20 sets per muscle group to failure with whatever load I can do in the 8 to 12 rep range, even though the loads have dropped to like 60% of what they were. Like, that doesn't happen without you noticing.
Yeah.
And the emotional state you would be in to get to that point is going to be pretty distraught, And the only thing keeping you from falling asleep between sets is the fact that you're in constant pain in all of your muscles. Like if you try to think of a scenario where you're doing the amount of work and volume that an overtraining endurance athlete does through resistance training, it's absurd.
Okay. So then,
and you would probably get injured 3 days earlier before you even got to that point.
Yeah, exactly. Which oftentimes has happened to many of us.
Of us, us and our athletes. So what is useful then?
Basically, it's like, what is the amount? It kind of goes back to some of our discussions on volume that we've had. Like, what's an appropriate amount of volume? And then what is the appropriate amount of volume at a given intensity? And what's an appropriate amount of volume at a given intensity in different states of life stress, in different states of amount of cardio you're doing, in different states of what you're eating, and in different states of body fat? All those things kind of like Brad said, you have to consider the environment that you're training within, what's reasonable, and then what's enough to get progress and what's the most you can do. And then probably somewhere between those is where you want to fall. And then have a system in place to modulate that or auto-regulate it so that, when you're underdoing it or when you're overdoing it, it can adjust to some degree. Maybe not even auto-regulate, maybe even just regulate it via a coach, And then have some way of assessing how you can change or improve your environment,
Yeah.
So it all comes back to the question of how much training should we be doing?
Man. Okay. Brad, as a coach, if you could think, I don't know if you could even summarize this, but like of the past maybe 10, 15, 20 people where you've gone in and purposefully cut back their volume, what were some of those situations? Do you feel like it was a programming thing that you tried to regulate for them and it was maybe a bad call? Do you feel like it was something in their personal environment? Do you feel like it was always because of prepping? Like, is there a commonality that you can think of, or a few common things that tend to happen?
Let me make sure I understand your question correctly. Was there ever a time where I cut back a person's volume and I regretted it? Is that what you're asking?
No, like of the times, which I know it doesn't happen, usually we're increasing volume over time, but sometimes we have to take a step back. And when you have to take a step back, is it because maybe you increased prematurely? Or maybe because maybe it's typically a life environment thing. Maybe it's typically when someone is prepping. Like, when does that usually happen that you have to take a step backwards for your athlete?
Okay, all right. I think I understand you now. Okay. So, first
Basically,
of all,
why do you cut volume in your athletes?
Man, I could have said that, but I wanted it to sound fancier.
Well,
just let me be fancy, Eric.
Yeah.
Damn.
I'm just trying to help Brad understand. I'm just trying to facilitate.
And trust me, I need it. So yeah, I think the big thing that is probably my big theme a lot of times when I'm doing my programming is I try to be proactive. So in other words, I try to be very proactive with my deloads and plan ahead of time, for dropping volume on purpose, Depending on the athlete, of course, it's going to be between at most 3 to 6 weeks. I will purposely drop volume for a week. And a lot of times, as long as I am proactive and stick to that plan, stick to that strategy, whatever you want to call it, we almost never have to just up and cut volume because of whatever reason that might be. Okay. Now, there are times when it happens, and typically, again, it's that environment. Like, I can think of a couple times where we had to run, for example, an extended deload, or we had to run a deload before we actually had planned, right? And it's usually some of those things I just mentioned. It might be a prepper. It might be a person that's actually in a caloric deficit, Maybe we tried to stretch a digging phase just a teensy bit too long, and they've lost motivation. They actually are digressing. They actually are feeling massive decreases in strength, whatever. And it's like, okay, we had a deload planned in 2 weeks. We're going to pop one right now, and I'll just drop their volume right now. Cap sets, bring down intensity 10%. Sometimes both, right? And sometimes I've had to do that, for an extended period of time, longer than a week, 10 days, 12 days, 14 days, whatever. And the other one that kind of comes to mind is a person that's fed. We always kind of think as nutrition is kind of the trump card, right? As long as we're eating enough, we're going to be okay. We can do whatever the hell we want in the gym. However, this particular client, there's a lot happening. Had to drop out of one university and go to another university. They had to move from one country to another country, all the while still. And this athlete liked a lot of volume, and most of the time they could handle it, except during this period of time. And so again, we had to drop volume. And in this particular case, I had a microcycle of training plan. I said, we just got to take this one microcycle and not fit it into 8 days. We got to stretch this out over the course of 2 weeks, 20 days, whatever it takes. So again, it's kind of that environment of everything that's happening around that forces us to bring down volume for, whatever reason that I just mentioned. But I really do truly feel like if you're proactive and making sure that you're staying ahead of the curve and doing your deloads and planning and sticking to your game plan, regardless of how you're quote unquote feeling, you almost don't have to do that unless something catastrophic happens.
Yeah.
That was a really long answer.
No, I liked it. I liked it. I usually do that, so it's good that you did that. You brought up a lot of really good practical ways to make that decrease without someone being like, oh my God, everything hurts. I'm just going to not do my program. Like how you said, like dropping 10%, dropping a set from everything, or stretching out the current cycle. And maybe you only, instead of training 6 days, you do every other day. So it takes you 2 weeks to get those 6 workouts in or something like that. So I like that.
all stuff that is in my deload book when we have our plug and play deloads for particular circumstances.
Yes. Hashtag coming soon. It's funny too, because we just had last season we had a podcast on volume, I think. And then we also talked to Eric in a different podcast more recently about some recent findings that we tend to need more volume than we think to continue making progress than we previously thought. Say it right for me.
So perhaps to the maximal adaptation or rate of adaptation occurs with substantially high volumes, and for those who are non-responders, the answer probably is more volume, unfortunately, rather than some other answer.
Yeah.
In many cases.
And to be honest, I think we're usually pretty safe and conservative. But do you think this is something that, I say we as in like as a team, we've always been like, okay, do as much as you need to keep progressing, but if there is this like hashtag next level, or like hashtagging, I don't know why, if there's this next level that does help you get to where you want quicker without hurting you, should we test that? And then how do we know the difference between that and avoiding this overreaching acutely thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that a lot of that is very like context specific, like who are you working with? So for the audience, anyone who's personal training individuals is going to have a very different answer to what I'm about to say. So with our athletes, like even a novice bodybuilder is an experienced lifter. If you put them in the literature, they're a trained athlete typically.
Can you give that general definition for most literature?
Sure. So in the research, if you've been training 6 months or longer, you're often considered a trained lifter.
For like 3 days a week, right? Isn't that it?
Yeah,
it's like 30 minutes, 3 days a week for 6 months.
And a lot of times in more like specific strength training research, it's like, can you at least bench body weight and squat 1.5 times body weight as a male?
Oh wow.
So that's lifting. Some people like like Andy Bolton, deadlifted 660 the first time they ever did it.
That's nice.
So that's why he's a world record holder.
Thanks,
or was.
Andy Bolton, for making us feel terrible about ourselves. Appreciate it.
This is why he's a legend. But so that's not a perfect definition for training experience. But the point is, if you were to look at research on trained individuals, that describes all of our clients and probably is a too low of a bar for our clients. So when I say this about our clients, it's with that context. Seeing any progress at all with our clients probably is pretty close to seeing optimal progress, because there's only so much you can get out of them because they're so close to their genetic ceiling in most cases. They've almost all been lifting for at least 2 to 3 years. And many times we're working with, like, I have people who have been a pro for 5 years since I've been started working with them, and they're in their late 30s. So if they're progressing, that's probably about as good as it's going to get. It's not as like if you did another 20% that they would grow another 20%. In fact, I think that they're probably like topped out. Like if you're progressing at that stage, great, you're doing most everything right. Now, when you have an early stage beginner, they will progress on one one set per week, because that's more than what they were doing. But that's probably just an unnecessarily low level of volume. It's not appropriate for skill acquisition. It's not appropriate for hypertrophy. It's not appropriate for strength. You could easily have them get in 10 sets per week per body part and get that done in a an upper lower split, 1 hour each session, which is very easy to do. And that would drastically increase their progress, probably by 50% if compared to just doing a couple sets once per week. So clearly, just seeing progress isn't appropriate in like true novices. But just seeing progress when you're talking about competitive bodybuilders and powerlifters ain't bad at all.
Yeah. It's just hard because when it takes so long to know that, right? Like for example, Brad, actually I put both of them in this, like you won't see if it's quote unquote working for a couple months, and so that I guess that's where the fine line is. And then maybe they're too advanced, like maybe me or I'd say the average of our roster, someone maybe lifting 5 to 10 years. Like that, I guess that's where it gets like real gray, is like, but could I do more?
I think you can also look at it over progress over time frames too. Right. So even if the absolute progress isn't much, but it's occurring frequently, that's actually a lot over a month or something like that. So if you're making incremental progress workout to workout, that's really fast. Like if you can add, 2.5 kgs to the bar once, like let's say you have 2 bench sessions per week and you do the same reps and you just go up 2.5, that's 25 kgs you're adding every 10 weeks. That's incredibly fast progress.
Yeah.
So, basically I think the way to kind of answer that question for those intermediate stage lifters, I like to be able to see them make progress every mesocycle. So, like if what we were handling for 3x8 4 weeks ago, you can now handle for 3x9, or you can go up 2.5 kgs and do 3x8 with that. And the RPEs are relatively similar. Sweet. That's still pretty good. And again, that's fast progress. That's basically adding 2.5 kg every month, which again we're looking at like 30 kgs in a year.
That's huge.
I think.
Yeah. I don't know the math, but
whatever
the by month,
12.
It sounded like a lot. Yeah.
And I think that's 30. So.
For those of us who can math.
Yeah.
Which is none of us, obviously. Okay, so then in
some
terms,
of that,
go ahead.
You have to. Sorry, I was just going to say. So you kind of have to rely on your coaching experience to know what is a quote unquote normal rate of progress at different stages of development for different lifters and at different body weights and strength levels. Obviously, if you're a 57 kg female lifter and the best bench you're ever going to get is, let's say, 80 kilos, and that's a world class level bench for someone who weighs that much. Going up 2.5 kgs is a lot different than when you are a 105 kg lifter and the best bench you're ever going to get is 200 kgs. You can expect a third of the kind of relative
Percentage-wise,
progress. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. But a similar time course, just smaller magnitude.
Yeah. Real quick favor, guys. If you enjoy these shows and have been a listener for quite some time, we would really, 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 really appreciate it if you would take the time to give us a review on iTunes. Having lots of ratings and audience feedback makes our show become more visible across multiple platforms, which then supports our mission of helping as many people as possible to be the best athletes, coaches, and lifting enthusiasts they could possibly be. So if you're not driving and it wouldn't be super dangerous at the moment, pause this thing right now, give us an honest review on your podcast app, and we would love you even more than we already do. Thanks for taking the time. Hope you enjoy the show. I want to talk more about obviously we know overtraining. I think we beat that one. Endurance, hard to do. It's going to sneak up, and it's probably not even going to sneak up on you because you're a strength athlete because you're listening to this. Mm-hmm. Overreaching, now we talked about it in Brad's couple scenarios that laid out, localized, very acute, very aggressive. But in terms of what's functional, like you talked about, when and why would we do that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
go ahead, Brad.
If I go, Eric?
Absolutely, you go for it, brother.
I think I probably use the term overreaching a little bit too loosely because I like if I have enough time to get a lifter ready for the platform, I almost like to plan for a very short overreaching cycle somewhere, in their macro cycle of training.
How often when you say somewhere? Like once a year?
No,
like how much time do you need?
Like we visit at one time for maybe a couple weeks, right in the middle of their prep. Okay.
So
and I'm not talking about
how long do you like a prep?
Once per meet prep is what you're talking about.
Exactly. Once a meet prep. So it always works best when we've got more time, right? So if we're talking say a good 20, 22 week prep, we'll say, okay. I kind of like to split things up, like I said, with deload. So I like to run a nice volume block, run a deload, run another volume block, and then a deload. And then perhaps, depending on the time frame, I might plan for a quote-unquote overreaching cycle. Okay. And during this overreaching cycle, the way that I typically plan it is usually by that time, volumes are pretty high. I like to quantify things by tonnage, right? Mm-hmm. And so these are like record tonnages now that they're reaching during maybe this second, volume block, okay? And so what I'll do during this overreaching cycle is with the tonnages and the volume kind of maxed out in a way, I'll very, very subtly see how much can we increase intensity, how much load can we add to the bar for maybe 2 weeks, right? So we come out of a deload, maybe we'll add a little bit of weight to the bar compared to the week previous to the deload. Maybe we'll eke out a little bit more, okay? And then if RPEs are still pretty low, and by low I mean I'm seeing 8.5 and 9, maybe one more week where we add a little bit of load to the bar. So that's my practical way of quote-unquote overreaching. We've maxed out volume and we can maybe just eke out intensity a little bit. Then we deload and we start doing the exact opposite. We start kind of dropping off volume while maybe we can bring up intensity as we're dropping off that volume right on into the meet, right, to where we actually will go into our expression phase where we're now expressing that strength that we've built. So again, I think I might use that.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah, go ahead.
So when you say you've maxed out volume, what markers or what kind of guidelines do you use to decide when you've reached what was max volume for that individual lifter?
Correct. That's actually a great question because I term it as, okay, they've never reached this kind of quote-unquote tonnage before. Mm-hmm. Reps, times, load, right, on everything. So that's, to me, that's maxed out. They've never done that before. They've never reached that kind of volume
So
before.
They've never done this much work in this amount of time.
Exactly. Now, is it MRV, hashtag MRV, maximum recoverable volume? Probably. Did I say volume? I think I meant volume. Maximum recoverable volume.
That was either
maximum recoverable volume. We would probably talk to, I don't know, Ian McCarthy about that or something.
Oh my gosh, what a huge slip of the tongue. But anyway, Is it? We don't even know that yet. Sometimes that's why I really question MRV, because here we are in this particular client, we've reached record volume, record tonnages. Could they still recover from more? Yeah, maybe. Why
do you
push
need
it?
to know that? Yeah, that's the big question.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But it's also not based off nothing. It's not just you setting a random program. Like you've looked at where they have been. You're seeing what they need to progress. How long? If you've been with the client a long time, you've probably seen what resulted in them feeling burnt out or not having enough time to, get it all done when they're time constraints. So it's certainly within the context and constraints of that individual lifter, a level of volume that is pushing those constraints.
Those constraints, yeah, exactly. And it's a short period of time. And, a lot of times, again, it's how much time do we have to do this? I will not even try that in someone that, say, is only doing a 12-week prep, right? We don't have enough time to run a couple volume cycles, build up a lot of work capacity, and then still have time to taper and express all of that strength from that volume down into the meat, right? So while I always will sometimes plan for a quote-unquote overreaching cycle, I don't always make it there. I don't always have enough time, and it may not even truly be overreaching. We've just kind of pushed record levels of volume at a given intensity.
Okay.
So anyway, Kirk, I kind of preempted you. You go.
No, I like that. So yeah, I guess the original question is when do we try to overreach functionally? And I think theoretically or conceptually, what I would say is that know that if you're going to do a true overreaching cycle, which would be defined by you're actually going to push volume, not in a way like Brad was talking about, but to the point until you actually see a decrement in performance, that if you want to do that before a taper, it is a gamble. Because you don't know really what's going to come on the other side until you do. You're not going to know if your taper was enough to result in a complete recovery of performance until it does. And you're almost, by definition, if you're going to overreach, taper, and then compete, you're dealing with a time frame which may or may not match up with the changing environment of their recovery status. So I'll give a concrete example here. Let's say you push them when they're 3 weeks out to the point where they're actually consistently underperforming and they are struggling, and by all intents and purposes, you push them past the limit, and you go, sweet, that's all good. Now we're going to climb down those steps for 2 weeks and taper into our meet. What if it takes 2.5 weeks to get them back to that level of performance? Or what if the amount of time spent tapering that they would need drops off not only the fatigue, but also it's too little volume, too little intensity for them to maintain the performance you achieved through that period.
Yeah,
exactly. So now let's say you haven't exposed them to heavy loading for 2.5 weeks. Maybe that's not enough for them to maintain their skill. So there's just a lot of variables going on there, especially them getting more nervous going into comp. And typically the psychological state of someone who is getting weaker, closer to comp, is the psychological state that makes you do some wacky stuff. It makes you change your form. It makes you think you need to do other random stuff. Your head's not in the right spot. You're on the platform second guessing your opener because it was too hard in training. And that's not a good position you want to be in. So I think there are second and third order effects that you need to think about when you take a strategy where you're purposefully trying to get someone actually overreached. And it's not something I recommend. That said,
yeah, as not a competitor, do we ever find it useful if there's never a deadline?
Oh yeah, actually, no. Outside of competition, I got no issue with that. Especially maybe for a lower risk activity like bodybuilding. Like if you want to take a block where you're like, you know what, I'm going to try pushing, my frequency up to each body part being trained 4 times a week, and I'm going to try to get, a 20% more sets done per body part and see how it goes. Hell, maybe all of a sudden you break a plateau and you start making gains and you don't see a dip in performance. You don't really know. I think experimenting with doing more in an intelligent environment for especially bodybuilding and certainly sometimes with powerlifting is not a bad idea. I think powerlifting you should be more conservative just because you're looking at 2 to 3 times the rate of injuries that occur in bodybuilding. And it's because it's heavier loads. There's no really way around it. But yeah, if you're going into a meet, I do not think you should probably purposely overreach. Now that said, there's going to be a ton of times where you're going to accidentally overreach, And then you just know to, like we've talked about, start the taper early, taper certain movements on a different pace, start emphasizing some environmental changes, et cetera, et cetera. Like I have definitely accidentally had to taper Bryce early multiple times. I can think of over the years where we've not intentionally overreached, but we have overreached,
So
yeah, and whenever there's not a deadline, I don't have a problem with overreaching a couple times a year, because you're going to have plenty of time to deload, to taper, to get back down to normal fatigue levels, and then start progressing. And a lot of times with enough time, when you do have that overreaching cycle, the next volume block that you run is usually pretty darn productive, as long as you could actually manifest and express that strength that you reached during that overreaching phase. So overreaching phase, if I do that in a power lifter, they're still 15 or 16 weeks from their deadline, right? But yeah, again, if there's no deadline, like Eric, shoot for the moon. See if you can put yourself into rhabdo. You can always hydrate and
we didn't say that. We didn't say that on this podcast.
You can always hydrate and get a little dialysis. That's
if you have really good insurance, it's worth it.
Yeah.
But expanding on having a deadline and not having enough time to taper and peak, I can think of a particular learning experience that I had with a particular athlete who was overreaching before they even came to me, right? And it was an eye-opening experience, and probably like my first real tangible way of seeing the effects of fatigue on training. Because I had seen this particular athlete, progress very well with very heavy loads, and then I can't get them to even get back to that certain level, And another reason why I kind of like to quantify things a little bit, because if I had that athlete during the time when they were the volume junkie, they were probably, tonnages that were 10 times over what I was programming, right?
Wow.
So what I was programming was actually a true deload, but we didn't have enough time to dissipate all that fatigue, and they actually went into the meet fatigue. Now that I think about it, Eric, listening to you actually talk about intensities and are they losing the manifestations of the adaptations, right? It's actually quite possible that it wasn't necessarily the fatigue, but it was because we had to use such low intensities compared to what they were using. They actually did lose a little bit of strength on that. But that was like the first time it was an eye-opening experience to where a 2-week, deload / taper was a speed bump. It wasn't even enough to slow down that fatigue train.
It's funny that happens to us so much more often with bodybuilders.
Oh yeah,
that are overworked, under-eaten for years, and then they come to us to prep in like 4 months, and you're like, but you haven't eaten in a real long time. So. Okay, so, but still, why is it useful? Or like, when is it more useful than like what Brad's example, what he says, like he might tell his athlete, this is an overreaching phase, but we have talked about in this podcast that it's actually just a very controlled elevation in volume. And then we progress from there versus like, what Eric said when he said, if you want to, do 4 times or double your frequency on these particular lifts because you're a bodybuilder, blah, blah, blah. Like, why would you pick one over the other? Aside, if there is no competitive deadline, why wouldn't you just do what Brad recommended for his athletes or whatever? Why would you want to take that more intense route, knowing that there could be a downside? Like, when is the positive possibly going to outweigh that downside?
I think so. We're talking about some pretty conservative, quote unquote, overreaching blocks, in my opinion, as far as what Brad described.
Yes.
Like, there's a block where we've figured out you can handle this level of volume, and then we're just going to see if we can linearly progress those loads at that volume. I think that's a very reasonable thing to do. That's kind of like what would just happen if that volume overreaching block was just your program. Like, I'm just going to try to progress that, right? So what I was suggesting outside of competition was the only time I think this would be useful is pushing the envelope a little bit more, not doubling your volume or doubling your frequency, but probably making an increase of 20% 20, 30%, which I think is pretty substantial. So that means if you're doing currently, 20 sets per body part, you're going to go to 26. That's a fairly amount. That's a fair amount of a volume increase, in my opinion. And I think it's important to do that because I've thrown around this phrase before. You need to pay attention. Like, regardless of how you train people or what you're doing as a coach, you can only learn from what you're doing if you pay attention in a systematic way. So if you never push against the boundaries of what you're doing with an athlete, you simply can only observe what you are doing. So if you have never tried anything outside of a moderate to moderately low volume program and you've manipulated every single other variable, but you've never had someone try benching, say, 3 times a week, but you've had them do chains, bands, close grip, wide grip, dumbbells and incline, but still never doing any more upper body pressing work than twice per week, you can't know if that might be too low volume until you try higher. And I use that, the best example of that I can give is my own progress that I made in upper body pushing when I just really started ramping up the volume and past any paradigm I believed was appropriate, coming from a kind of a powerlifting background where I kind of started with the West Side kind of template. Like I might have 1 day of DE or RE and then 1 day of ME. And then eventually I was like, maybe I can do like 1 accessory day of pressing and then two days of pressing. But it wasn't until I decided to do more than 3 workouts worth of pushing movements per week that I start to see a bunch of progress. And I felt fine workout to workout. Because I was never actually feeling any kind of recovery issue, or I would never be acutely weaker because of a prior workout when I was training 2 or 3 times per week. I just wasn't getting stronger. And I was changing a lot of variables, but not anything that was outside of my willingness to change. So I think you do need to sometimes push your constraints and push your boundaries with an athlete, especially if they're not making progress, to see if maybe something outside of those typical fallback options you use as a coach could be the successful strategy for that person.
Yeah. It's funny, too, I didn't think about it till that story just came up again, is that we've been talking about like overtraining syndrome, you said, and then overreaching. I know we said acutely, like with Brad's injuries or whatever, but I didn't think about how quick everyone is to recognize that when I have a lagging body part, I'm going to give it more volume, but like that is overreaching, right? Just body part specific overreaching.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
It's a creative way of finding how can I do more,
Mm-hmm. But like, that podcast was a long time ago, but I have like a 3-part article series based on that on the blog that Steve will definitely link to because he's amazing. In the show notes. Yeah, body part specialization, but like, it's not a term that's used.
I'm not sure when this is going to come out, but my next blog post that will come out on the 14th of August is going to be on setting up body part splits with higher volume.
Sweet. And so, but that, like I said, like overreaching, just not a term we use a lot. Like we say, how to address this body part, but that's in essence what it is, right? You're overreaching on this certain.
And that's the thing, though. It may not even be overreaching. You may find that, well, shit, if I want to progress this body part, it just needs more volume.
This is what I do now. Yeah.
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 Or you find that, man, to get that body part to grow, I have to do more volume than I can recover from in the context of an appropriate volume for all my other body parts. Mm-hmm. So the systemic volume that results from me trying to, let's say, improve my quads is too much. So therefore, it is overreaching because I have to rotate it in and do it for just periods. Go gain back to maintenance, focus on everything else, gain back to maintenance. So a specialization could be an overreaching cycle for a body part because it needs to be. Because if you did it for everything like that, you would be overreached. Or it might just be a discovery that, man, you can handle a lot more than you thought, at least for that body part.
That you were being a bitch. That's what Brad says.
Exactly.
Not on purpose, obviously. Okay. What would be some... Oh, go ahead. Brad, did you want to say something? I feel like I cut you off.
I just am really enjoying this awesome discussion.
Right?
So.
Told y'all it was going to be fun like 20 minutes ago or something. I forgot what I was going to say now, though, so that's cool.
You said, what would be some strategies?
No, I didn't say strategies because okay, what would be the
Tactics.
verbiage that you hear? Because like I'm trying to think like when Brad says I'm going to nudge him here, right? Wouldn't they tell you things? Signs of it as a coach, you're like, oh, that sounds like it's really intense, but like you meant for this to happen, right? Versus again when someone's being a bitch, or when you are actually, or like in prep, what are the things they say? We're like, oh, maybe we are overreaching, like because there's times where you want to hear that they're having a hard time, right? And there's times when they're having a hard time.
Mm-hmm. There's times
they're
when
like,
you
oh
expect
shit,
it, and then there's times when you're like, wow, I was not expecting that.
Yeah.
yeah,
I think it's also very, again, like population specific of who you're working with. Like if you work with general population people who are either learning to love lifting or simply don't love lifting but do it because they like what it gets them, you're going to have very different language.
yeah,
You could push the volume to something below what would be optimal or even stressful, and they'd be like, "Man, this is a pain in the ass," you know.
Mm-hmm.
However, when I'm working with bodybuilders and powerlifters, especially those who've been at it for a while, I'm going to go ahead and say I'm comfortable to say this. Competitive bodybuilders and powerlifters, I don't know any who don't enjoy training. Big picture, don't enjoy training. But they can get to the point in prep where they don't enjoy training, where they're dreading doing the squat, bench, and deadlift because they're in pain when they do it, or their performance is so variable that it can wreck their day emotionally because all of a sudden, like my deadlift max is 250, but 210 today was an RPE 9.5. Or a bodybuilder who is dreading going to the gym because every set feels like a Herculean effort just to walk it out of the rack. So I think it's probably the best piece of information is just listening to athletes about their feelings about training, their motivation to train, and the mental gymnastics they might have to do to perform in training, not physically, but to get themselves into mental state to perform physically. So when someone tells me like, man, it's like an absolute slog or a marathon to go through this leg day, or I dread the entire day having to do squats, that's when I go, right, let's switch it to leg press, or let's pull a couple sets back, or maybe we need a deload, or maybe we need a diet break. So that's the kind of verbiage that I pay attention to, is when all of a sudden someone who loves lifting is dreading lifting.
okay. Anything to add, Brad?
Only that I really see that in bodybuilders, you know, especially during like digging phases. Sometimes I just had a client just kind of, it hit me upside the head. I took this guy, I felt like I ruined him. I took this guy that loved his training, loved his lifting, and he sends me a midweek report that says basically what Eric just said. I basically dread my life right now.
That's prep,
so, yeah,
all right.
I literally thought I ruined this guy. I really did. Thank God, you know, we were kind of auto-regulating in the classic sense to where he, you know, made a specific fatigue stop RPE, and I instructed him regardless of what the set was or the rep was. When you make that fatigue stop RPE, you move on. And so he was having like record lows as far as tonnages for the week. But just imagine how much more that guy would have been wrecked if he would have had that, you know, hashtag go hard or go home approach and stuck to his program, number of reps, number of sets to the letter, you know, while being in that, again, environment, right? It would have wrecked the guy worse, you know? So yeah, there again, to answer that question you were asking earlier, we got to do something at that point. We got to say, okay, you know what? Diet break, high days every day for the next 7, 8, 9, 10 days, whatever it takes, right? Transitional block of training. Swap out all your squats for leg presses. Swap out your poor, you know, dismal bench press for dumbbells. You know, the hammer strength press where you can actually put 2 or 3 plates on that thing and feel good. You know, yeah, absolutely. It will with bodybuilders when they're digging. Sometimes it'll just hit you in the face like a ton of bricks.
Yeah,
and,
there's like a day where you're like, and now this sucks.
Exactly. Yeah. And there again, environment. That was an environment that led to that.
Do we see this often, or do either of y'all really see this in bodybuilders that aren't dieting? Well, I imagine, but not bodybuilders so much. I was going to say, I imagine you guys both did this to yourselves back in the day, from stories I've heard.
It takes a lot more.
Yeah, a lot more. Yeah.
I think with the kind of paradigm that we use when working with 3DMJ athletes, the verbiage is a lot more subtle. So if you're working someone in the off season and they complain about their deload, that's just standard, right?
Yeah.
If you're working with someone in the off season and you're pushing their volume up a lot, the deload will come and they'll be happy to do it and they won't say shit, or they'll be like, "Oh, I'm glad the deload was coming." So I've experienced this myself too. The difference between having kind of a steady state program or just trying to push up my numbers versus a couple months ago I was experimenting with adding a set to each exercise per week. Whew, that fourth week came around and I was doing 5 sets on everything. I was like thinking like 2 days, I'm training like Monday through Friday. This is an example. It's not actually what happened. On Thursday, the day before I even finished my training cycle, I'm thinking like mid-workout, like, okay, tomorrow's the last day where I got to do 5 sets and then I get my deload, which is a different experience and it's certainly a different attitude that you can see in off season, but not as common.
Okay. And a lot of times the clients that are non-dieting bodybuilders, it's not so much hunger issues or lack of strength. Sometimes strength when it plummets is just demoralizing, right? But it's just downright pain. It's not like an injury. It's not like joint pain. It's just fatigue. It's fatigue from handling heavy loads every single workout. It's kind of an odd thing, and I felt it before very rarely, and only in what seems like specific cases. But it's just your body feels fine until you get that load on you. And then once you start squatting it ain't bad. When you're actually moving the weight, it's not bad. But just getting that load on you, I'm in a fed state, and I'm rested. And...
Grow up, Eric. Jeez.
No, believe it or not, I was actually laughing at a memory that Brad's description just reminded me of would have been 2008. So it would have been my 4th year of training.
It's funny is 20 minutes ago, if you're watching the YouTube video, Brad said doo-doo, and me and Eric looked at each other and started laughing. Yeah. And now I'm giving Eric shit.
Yeah, and I wasn't even thinking at this time.
I wasn't even thinking that, yeah.
But when you said doo-doo earlier, I almost lost it, but I held it together. I was real proud of myself.
Powerlifters do.
And I'm just like, okay.
Powerlifters poop. So if I can tell a story.
I guess you can finish.
Yeah, 2008.
Sorry.
Yeah, so 2008, I was training with my old training partner, shout out Todd, and in Sacramento. And we were following a leg program where we started it off with 10 triples and on squats. And we did that, I want to say, for like a full mesocycle. We might have done like 6 sessions or something like that. Now, we were supposed to do like some lower percentage, but we were basically doing like 90% of our 1RM. So we were doing like our 4RM for 10 by 3. And we were fucking nuts. Like there would be times where I would actually stand in the squat rack in front of Todd, not spotting him, but preventing him from racking it. So we had the mental fortitude to get through it.
Safe. Real safe.
Not even kidding. So, well, it was one of those squat racks where it had like the descending racks.
The angle,
and then, like,
yeah.
The bar, so he could have dumped it behind it if he needed to, but he couldn't have racked it.
Again, safe.
Go hard or go home. So we were doing 10 sets of 3, and we consistently would say stuff like, the bar 135 and 225 feel terrible. Like, you know how when you're really beat up from training, like there's like the toilet test, like whether you can just sit down in the toilet without making any noise and it's a smooth movement. But like when you've been really beat up from training, like it's this jerky movement, like you're getting gears stuck on the way down, like chunk, 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 to sit down. Like there's like little catches, like, oh, right here my IT band feels sore, and about like this hip angle. Here my lumbar is sore, and then a little bit lower my hamstring. It's crazy, and then I'm fine. And then when I stand up, my glute like contracts on me. Like if no noise comes out and you just sit down easily, you're probably not in this situation. But we didn't feel good until we had 275 on our backs for warm-ups. That was the only weight that was easy to hit depth with, and there wasn't that kind of like stuck gear.
Yeah.
Eccentric. Yeah. And that's not good. But we thought that was like normal, where like 135 feels like death when you're a 400-pound squatter,
Yeah. Do you think that some people can operate at much higher level? Like, I know you said like, and that's not good, but are there some people that you think can spend a lot of their time close to that without?
Oh, being in this under-recovered, beat-up state without it actually resulting in an impedance to their performance?
Yeah, like at pretty high
Yes.
levels of athletics, that's pretty standard,
Mm.
right?
Yep. Well, we were still performing.
That's what I'm saying. Like, so.
Like we still, I think there, I peaked at like 10 sets of three with 335, like, and that was 20 pounds up from where I started despite feeling like ass for 6 weeks or whatever it was. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Like, at what, sometimes is it cool to feel like ass for?
Sure. Absolutely.
That's what I'm saying. Like,
I
is
just
it just
don't.
maybe what you can take within your lifestyle environment?
Well, I think that's also an indicator. You should also be aware that that probably shouldn't be your steady state condition. Something will come of that eventually that you don't want or that is counterproductive. You should have periods of restoration. Like, for example, I'll use Bryce just because he has consistent competition. So that's a nice thing. When you get to power through a certain level, there's always nationals and there's always worlds and there's maybe one other meet. And after nationals and after worlds, we have like a restoration block of training, so that he can actually make it, because he has felt just like we're describing for a while, sometimes too much, and because there are negative effects from that both psychologically and physiologically. If it prevents you from feeling safe when deadlifting, that's not going to be a good deadlift session,
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, it is context specific, but like, yeah, like you might need to feel like that for a consecutive volume and intensity block, each one lasting 3 to 6 weeks. So maybe 12 weeks at a time you could feel like that, but it shouldn't be that's the way training feels all the time.
This is my life.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean,
Yeah,
it's like
exactly.
any other, it's just hard because I think I almost said hashtag fitness, but then I did. Okay, so hashtag fitness, right? I love this lifestyle. I love lifting. This is what I do every day. This is what brings me joy, gives me peace, like all whatever. Okay, so there's that, right? And then, but at the same time, when you think athletics though, and competition, every sport has seasons,
Mm-hmm.
right?
And it should.
Yes.
Yeah, and so I think
That's the
it's
downside.
it's psychologically difficult, right?
Mhm.
And I'm hello, personal experience here. I love
Yep.
to feel pretty much beat the fuck up at least once a day. I really enjoy it. And I understand the purpose of the deloads and the purpose of seasons, but at the same time, like it's almost like I have to have heavy conditioning in my day to day, because if I got that feeling from weightlifting is when I kill myself.
Yeah. It's the difference between feeling all of the associated feelings of hard work and pushing
Yes.
yourself and fatigue. But if that is all applied through a highly mechanically stressful sport or movement or exercise, then it will also result in mechanical fatigue and potential
Yeah.
damage.
Yeah.
So that's you're right though. Like so people who are casually into serious fitness, so it's not casual. They're into serious fitness but don't have a traditional sports structure. An easy example that will apply to a lot of our listeners is people who compete in powerlifting who aren't at the elite level. So you can do as many damn meets as are on the schedule, and they're going to happen all damn year long. So those people actually struggle a little bit more because they're going to be, due to time constraints. I've seen people do 5 meets a year, back to back to back to back. And that can really force you into a position where you have to do a lot of comp lift specific training. So you're doing a lot of squat, benches, and deadlifts. And it's the rare person who is built to handle the super high volume and frequency of those without any kind of wear and tear. And you have to do competition specific intensities. So at least 5 times you're going to be handling near maximal loads. That's a recipe that looks a lot different than a athlete who has a competitive season, like you said, where there's an off season, transition period. general prep, specific prep, etc. So a lot of the structures that are in place for someone who's in a more organized sporting environment aren't there, and the person is doing this more frequent, constant stress with higher loads and with high-risk movements that may or may not suit their body type.
Yeah.
Because they're required for the sport.
Yeah.
Kind of coming full circle back to your article again.
Yeah, it's just hard to think about. Not hard to think about. It's like the type of people that get into these sports are the type of people that like to work hard. And then at a certain point when you get good, you have to not work as hard as you can because you become at risk. So it's like this weird...
Mm-hmm. You gotta get smart at a certain point. I think it's become super, super obvious to me because in the last a little over a year now, I'd say year and a half, I have been training much more for bodybuilding. And because of the hip surgery I had and minor neck injury, I had to be creative. So, and outside of this neck thing that kind of randomly came up, I've been way more pain-free bodybuilding compared to when I was powerlifting, and doing things like lunges, high bar squats and front squats, leg extensions, leg press, RDLs, good mornings, hip thrusts, a lot of exercises, a lot of volume, and getting way more DOMs than I used to, and getting a lot more muscular stress, but just in just a ridiculously lower amount of joint and soft tissue, tendon, and ligament stress, because I had to do sumo deadlifts and low bar back squats, 2 or 3 times a week to make progress. So
yeah,
I think
so it's like
that's very eye-opening for me.
Yeah, that's good to know.
Eric, can I ask you a quick question? When you do your more bodybuilding type training like you are now, first of all, like how many hard sets? Like what would you say that your last set RPE is, or how many hard sets would you say that you do?
It's exercise specific to some degree, but I'll give you an example. So like I'm currently in a glute, ham, and back specialization cycle. So my leg days are very dominant. So I will start with 4 sets of RDLs. Then I'll do 4 sets of hip thrusts on the leg curl machine. Then I'll do 4 sets of leg curls. Then I will do 3 sets of lunges. That's the only quad work I do. And then I'll finish with abduction and calf raises. Mm-hmm. Abduction and calf raises, those are all in 8 to 10 RPE. I'm probably finishing close to failure on my last set. The lunges are probably around 8 to 9 RPE last set. The hip thrusts are around a 9 to 10 RPE last set, as are the leg curls. And then the RDL, I'm probably finishing around a 7 or 8 RPE on the last set. So if you look at that, like if you were to try to accomplish that from squats and deadlifts, that'd be like a really hard workout. Mm-hmm. That's basically 15 sets of like compound leg exercises. Oh, I know some of them are isolation, but yeah. And like so my quad day, I do 4 sets of squats, 4 sets of leg press, and 4 sets of leg extensions. If I did 12 sets of squats, then probably a similar quad stimulus, but I'd be done.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And is the first set, would you say, pretty darn easy? Like, does the first set of 4 kind of almost feel like a warm-up set in a way?
No, it does on the big compounds, but it's because I'm working in like the 4 to 8 rep range for the first big movement, and then I'm working in like 8 to 12 and then 12 to 15. So we'll use that easy example of squat, leg press, leg extension. I'll do a set of 6 at a 7 RPE for my first set. And then it might climb up to 7, and like 6.5 to 7.5 be my first set. And it'll climb all the way up, probably no higher than a 8.5, potentially a 9 if I'm feeling aggressive that day by my 4th set. So that's like average intensity for squats in a powerlifting program. And then on leg press, I take it to the house. And then on leg extensions, I take it to the house.
Much safer movements, yeah. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Take it to the house. Is that Master P?
I don't think
He did.
He did make a lot of people say,
Take it to the house. Oh man, who was it? It was remade.
Oh wait,
by
take
a
it
rap.
to the house.
Yeah.
Oh, who was that?
Yeah.
Trick Daddy?
Oh yeah, that sounds right. That
Maybe.
sounds right.
I don't know. I don't.
That sounds
That's
right.
someone in the
It was
audience.
like
Someone
someone
is
in the
yelling at
305.
their podcast
Yeah.
right
Someone
now.
in the
Yeah.
305. I feel like he would say 305. Take it to the house. No.
That sounds right. Yeah.
Stupid. Okay, so to wrap it up, practical takeaways. Overtraining, I think we probably don't do that, so that's not super practical. But as far as overreaching,
Yeah, don't overtrain.
don't do that, and you probably won't. So,
Yeah.
with the overreaching, there's useful and not useful. When it's not useful, you can't return from it for how long? Like, how do you know?
Yeah.
Okay,
Couple
I say
weeks.
Longer.
Okay, so let's say, how long would you say an overreaching mesocycle should be, like, at minimum or maximum? Like, am I going to go hard for 2 weeks? Do I need to go hard for at least a longer amount of time? I don't know.
I would say in most cases, so to kind of recap what we said, overtraining, you're probably not experiencing it. Something else is going to make the wheels fall off before textbook overtraining syndrome.
Yeah.
If you are experiencing it, you know it, and you're probably in the midst of prep and not having a fun time in life in general.
And you'll get there, so.
Yeah.
It has an end date.
Yes. Functional and non-functional overreaching. So non-functional overreaching means that after a taper, after overreaching, which means you've actually seen a decrement in your performance, and you've tapered, you've either gotten back to baseline, so before you had a decrement, but you haven't improved. That's non-functional. Functional is you're actually better. You probably don't want to attempt purposefully overreaching at all in preparation for a contest. Unless, like Brad said, you got 22 weeks and you have a lot of time to correct that error if it does seem to be non-functional. You might want to experiment with overreaching in the off season when you're just trying to push volumes to see what your true limits are. Just be aware not to do it too fast, too quick, or with a lot of movements that can potentially cause injury. So, did that answer your question, Andrew?
Yeah, I think so. Specific time frames, if you could, like general recommendations. Yeah.
So straight up overtraining, we're looking at months, where you're in the hole regardless of what you do, and you can't get your performance back. Functional overreaching means after the taper, so we're talking 1 to 3 weeks. You're seeing performance come back. Non-functional just means it's not back, might take another few weeks. As far as if you do try to overreach, how long should you do it?
Yes.
I would say microcycles, maybe 1 or 2. So it should be an overreaching block would build up to that. If you were in the off season, and we're talking about like a bodybuilder playing with higher volumes, I could see a mesocycle of 3 to 6 weeks where you're really pushing volumes, so long as you're being intelligent about how that fits into everything. We've got a lot of data where we push volumes up to crazy amounts, and studies typically last 6 to 12 weeks. So I think it's pretty reasonable to say 8 weeks is the most you should be experimenting with super high volume. Yeah.
Okay.
And I like kind of how you said intelligent ways of pushing that volume. Instead of doing 15 sets of squats, do 3 sets of squats, 3 sets of leg press, 3 sets of leg extensions, 3 sets of split squats, and 3 sets of band walks going forward and bending at the knees.
Yeah. And I think it's easy for bodybuilders to onboard that information. Powerlifters will struggle a little more. Mm-hmm. So I would say for a powerlifter, you should really only consider doing a high volume, overreaching off-season cycle where you're trying to push volume up as high as you can with movements that don't cause you joint stress. So like even if it's your competition lift, if back squats, the amount you do and the load you do linearly scales with how much pain you experience, that's not a viable movement to overreach with. You could try doing more accessory work. You could try doing front squats or safety bar squats, but maintain a normal volume of your competition lifts. Yeah. That's kind of that's what I would recommend for powerlifters.
Yeah, that's really good stuff.
Y'all, I think this podcast was real good stuff.
I feel like we did some. I feel like we had the right stuff.
I've loved it.
Is that New Kids on the Block?
Mhm.
Oh my God. NKOTB? What?
Yes.
Okay, we'll leave it there before I embarrass myself more. Thanks, guys. Thanks so much for listening, guys. 3DMJ prides itself on keeping this show, our blog, and our YouTube channel as free and relevant sources of information for our community week after week. We also release additional free video courses as often as possible at 3dmjvault.com. If you'd like to help support our mission and our work, please consider becoming a monthly patron of our endeavors. Go to patreon.com/team3dmj and donate as little as $1 per month to our cause of helping educate and grow the drug-free bodybuilding and powerlifting communities worldwide. You can definitely choose to donate more, and if you do so, we'll send you discount codes for future use on any of our paid products. But any little bit helps, and we appreciate your monthly support in any amount that you see fit. So again, you can start assisting the team at patreon.com/team3dmj. That's patreon.com/team3dmj. Thanks for sticking around, and we'll see you in the next show.